Hello, friends. Hello, 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 hello. And hi, Peter.
Hi, Austen.
How are you doing tonight, Peter? I feel like I have
I'm
to be very specific about who I'm talking to, whether I'm talking to you or chat.
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here. This is an interesting passage that we're discussing.
I know, I'm really excited to talk about it.
Yeah.
Well, welcome everybody who's in the chat. It's Peter and myself here tonight. Usually we have Micah Melody around as well, but Micah is on a very well-deserved vacation. And so Peter and I are going to be talking about a passage with you all. And because Micah Melody is not with us tonight, we are not going to be quite as slick with our tech as we normally would be, because she's the tech master. But we are going to do our best, and we are excited to talk about this passage with you because we tried to talk about this story with you last month. I tried to talk about this story with you last month, and the internet issues were so bad that we were like, you know what? We can't even carry on. So we're talking about the same story this month that we meant to talk about last month. And that's actually a very exciting thing because a lot has happened in a month that influences the way that we read this story. And I get to hang out with Peter and we get to talk about it together. So that's
Aw.
much better than, it's much better to have friends, much better to do things with friends. Well, hello. I see people in the chat already. I see Amory. Hi, Amory. And I see Brian. It's good to see you all. If you are in the chat and you want to say hey, go ahead and say hey, because we're always excited to know who's here with us and hanging out. And as we work through this passage together, we'll have lots of things to mull over and ponder and talk about. So feel free to do that in the chat, and we'll be interacting with you there. Peter, how do you want to introduce this passage tonight? Is there anything you want to say about what this passage is, where it comes in the biblical story, or any thoughts or history that you have with this story?
I don't have any personal history with this passage. I remember it from the children's Bible that I grew up with. I remember an extremely disturbing illustration showing the bones coming to life. But I think it's come to have more resonance for me as an adult. And I think, we'll probably get into this later, but sort of the lifeless bones coming back to life and how that has resonance for me as a trans person and the ways in which I've been able to bring life back into my body and allow God to do that work in my body as well. I think there's a lot of points of resonance there for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's like the whole reason that when we were thinking about Bible passages for our next Bible study, this one came up because we're going to be talking about the story of Ezekiel and the dry bones. That's in Ezekiel chapter 37. And there's a lot of resonance there of coming back to life and being put together again in a new way, maybe, that I think resonates with a lot of trans and gender expansive folks. So it seemed like a good one for us to talk about. Yeah. I think it's funny that you mentioned the thing about the children's story Bible and a disturbing picture. I feel like my first introduction to this story was the Dem Bones song.
Oh yeah, I remember that song.
Yeah, it was like a Bible camp song, which is, I think, actually from a Black spiritual tradition, but it became that was where I heard it was Bible camp.
Is that the leg bone connected to the hip bone and all that kind of stuff?
Right.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, I remember learning that song, and I felt confused about the point of the song. I remember being like, is this an anatomy lesson? Are we supposed to understand how bones are supposed to come together? Or are we supposed to understand the story? Or is it both? Or what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah, it's purely just a dry anatomical account of how the body works. Nothing, no spiritual significance whatsoever.
And there probably is. I'm betting the original song probably has a lot more of that. But probably. I don't know. It's just that's what I remember from camp.
Yep.
But welcome to Caitlin. Hi, Caitlin. I see you in the chat. Yes, exactly. You're on the song with us. I wonder if anybody else has any history or memories associated with this story of Ezekiel and the dry bones, because it's always kind of interesting to think about how we were introduced to these stories and where they come from. I feel like often stories with a lot of imagery like this one, when people think of the book of Ezekiel, this is kind of the main story that comes to mind. Like they think of this one, and then they think of like Ezekiel saw the wheel, right? That there's like a wheel in the sky that Ezekiel sees at one point. But those two images are kind of the only things that most people, I think, remember about Ezekiel, if anything. So we hold on to those really beautiful images, or really fascinating images, I think, especially with the prophets, because what are prophets even doing? Just running around yelling at people? Like what's up with prophets? Yeah, so as we think about this text, and as we think about getting into it, let us know if you have stories or thoughts about your connection to this story. To give you a little bit of background about what's going on in the Bible when this story happens, we can talk a little bit about where the people were. So the people of Israel at the time of Ezekiel were dealing with the Babylonian captivity, or the enslavement in Babylon. And so they basically were dealing with this idea of being taken away from their homeland and enslaved, right? And Ezekiel is really worried about the people as they are in this period of their life. Like, how are the people going to get through this, essentially? And Ezekiel comes from a prophetic lineage. He comes from not just a prophetic lineage, a priestly lineage. So he's very concerned with like the temple back in Jerusalem and how the temple is supposed to be. So he's very concerned about like order. Ezekiel is like, I guess you would call him sort of a lawful good. Like he sort of is just like, we got to follow the rules no matter what. And that's kind of part of Ezekiel's deal. So he's trying to talk to the people in this time when they're like in one of the worst things that could ever happen has happened to them. And Ezekiel sometimes has good news for the people, and sometimes just has confusing news. And so in this case, Ezekiel is getting a vision from God that is good, but also a little confusing, maybe. So that's kind of where things are when this is happening. I see Andy says, I once saw a beautiful liturgical dance during Easter Vigil using the dry bones imagery. Ooh, I love that. Yes, and we're actually going to talk about a dance and a translation. So we'll come to that, but put a pin in that, because we're going to talk a little bit about dance as an interpretation of this story before we're done tonight. Peter, what's your take on what a prophet is, or what a prophet is supposed to do?
Yeah, I read actually in preparing for this a really, I thought, very compelling sermon from a UCC pastor, Reverend Cynthia Robinson. And it was from, I think, 2021, so pretty recent. And it was just after, or not after, but sort of, a year into the pandemic. And she was reflecting on what that had meant for her congregation, and kind of what they had, what it had taught them about how they were as a community, how, what they needed to focus on in the future. And one thing so she talked about a couple of things in terms of what prophecy can be. And one of the things she talked about was how prophecy has to start with an acknowledgement of catastrophe. I just really liked that phrase. So you can't really talk about what the future holds, or what we need to do next, without acknowledging the catastrophe that we're seeing in front of us. So, you're talking about Ezekiel walking with, the people of Israel through one of the worst things they'd ever experienced. So starting with that acknowledgement of catastrophe, but then also an awareness that small changes aren't going to cut it. Like God's transformation is more than a reform. It's building something entirely new. So basically, the prophetic voice being the one that talks about these radical changes that are necessary. And so I think those are the two things that she said about prophecy that really seemed like very powerful to me. And she quoted this Black queer activist, Sonia Renee Taylor, talking about the pandemic, but I think it applies here too, who said, "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was never normal, other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return. we are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature.
I love that.
Yeah.
So those 2 points, right? I want to make sure that I'm hearing them right. The 2 points are, one, you have to acknowledge the catastrophe.
Yep.
And 2, you can't go back. Like it has to be something new has to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Here, I'm putting in the chat here for folks, which you'll get in a minute because of the delay. I'm putting the link to the sermon that Peter's referencing there. It reminds me, actually, you know this, Peter, but folks here in the chat might not know. I just got back from a week teaching at a place called Holden Village. It was a wonderful experience of doing Bible studies like this with people in real time, in real life, IRL. But one of the things we talked a lot about last week was what we were calling sort of like displaced nostalgia. The idea of like being nostalgic about a time before, whatever before meant. At this camp, it was like, well, before the camp had electricity, or before the camp had, like whatever, like like the camp was when I was little, like all the nostalgia for times past. And then realizing that like actually our memory always distorts things a little bit, and the past that we remember might not actually have been the past that really existed. I mentioned at one point that I had somebody come up and say, like, this whole thing about asking people their pronouns, it's hard and it makes me think a lot, and like I don't really like, I kind of wish we could just go back to just like introducing ourselves and not having to worry about that. And I said, yeah, it sounds like you want to go back to a time before trans people existed, except that never was.
Right. And that's part of that misplaced nostalgia, right? Is thinking that there was some past that actually did not exist, like
right?
Idealizing something, or creating this false narrative,
right? But at the same time, there are things about the past, or there are elements of that nostalgia that are real, like that they really like. Maybe this person really wants this kind of past where they didn't have to think so much about language because they feel really overwhelmed right now. And even though the past that they want might not actually have been the past that is, or that was, their need for simplicity because they're overwhelmed is real. And so like, how do we kind of, I love that. What was the analogy at the end of that quote? It was about like a patchwork garment or something like that.
Oh yeah. We're being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature.
Yeah. And I think that idea of like a patchwork thing, or a stitched together thing, is like, we can take the little bits of the past that were really good, the things that fill deep needs in us, and bring those forward without bringing the whole thing forward. And then we can kind of stitch that into something new.
Yeah. In fact, in the sermon too, Reverend Robinson talks about how in this story, like the bones are still the same bones, but all of what's put on top of those bones is new. And kind of realizing how significant that is to see. It's like, these are these really the same people? They have, the bones are the same, but so much is new through this like transformative act of God kind of in, there's sort of a co-creative element to it, right? Like Ezekiel and God together doing this. Which is kind of interesting.
We better stop and actually read the passage.
We haven't read the passage.
We're so into it. We have to actually read the passage.
Okay.
First, though, I want to notice, Caitlin says in the chat, I remember Ellen Davis asking the rhetorical question in Old Testament class with her, who will stand in the breach between God and humanity? And it's the prophet's place to speak for both parties to each other. Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Thank you, Caitlin, and Ellen Davis as well. That idea
of kind of high risk job for the prophet.
Oh yeah, I mean, like the prophets were doing all kinds of wacky stuff all the time to try to like create these metaphors with their lives, marrying people and not eating for forever. And then at one point, is it Ezekiel? I think it is Ezekiel at one point, who is made to like eat a scroll to like show something about eating words. So like wacky stuff happens. It's a high risk job being a prophet. But standing in the breach between God and humanity, that's a great way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that's really powerful.
Yeah. And I think to touch on where I get some of my ideas about what a prophet is from Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination. And so he talks about what a prophet is, but I'm going to hold off on my tiny quote from Brueggemann for a minute so that we can actually read the passage. So All right. Let's see. How about I'll read through verse 10 and then you can take up in verse 11. Does that sound okay, Peter?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. So for folks following along, if you've got a Bible with you, grab one in whatever version you like. We're going to be reading Isaiah chapter 37, verses 1 through 14. So I'm reading the NRSV version, by the way, in case people are wondering. It goes like this. The hand of the Lord came upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me down in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me all around them. There were very many lying in the valley, and they were very dry. He said to me, Mortal, can these bones live? I answered, O Lord God, you know. Then he said to me, Prophesy to these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. I will lay sinews on you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I had been commanded, and as I prophesied, suddenly there was a noise, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. I looked, and there were sinews on them, and flesh had come upon them, and skin had covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, mortal, and say to the breath, Thus says the Lord God, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain that they may live. I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet, a vast multitude.
Then he said to me, Mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. Therefore prophesy and say to them, Thus says the Lord God, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from your graves, O my people, and I will bring you back to the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from your graves, O my people. I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you on your own soil. Then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and will act, says the Lord.
What a thing. I feel like Ezekiel likes to do repetition a little bit. There are repetitive phrases in there that happen a couple of times. And that feels very in line to me about Ezekiel's sort of like order is the most important thing, order and following the rules and like organization.
It's funny that that's your response to those repeating phrases. Mine is to think that they sound very poetic and that like that's sort of like the rhythm of the language and the fact that those same phrases come back like feels very, very much like powerful poetry to me.
Yeah, for sure.
It can be both.
It can be both. So I wonder, folks who are reading along with us, what do you notice about this this passage? What jumps out to you? Are there any words or phrases or structures or images? What jumps out to you first about this story or about this passage? I think the sort of first thing that I notice is right at the very beginning. Asking that question of like to put us in a set time and place. Who are these dry bones? To kind of like if these dry bones are, because we get in what verse is it here, where it says these bones are the whole host of Israel. It's toward the end, I think. Yeah, verse 11. Mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. So in the beginning, you kind of don't really know what's going on.
You're right there with Ezekiel and the fact that you don't know what's going on.
Exactly. Yeah. Who are these bones? But even when it talks about like the whole host of Israel, like who are these people? What happened to them? Why are they dead? I think like setting us in that period of the Babylonian exile, you know, these are people. And when I think of what Walter Brueggemann says about people in the exile and what prophets do, Brueggemann talks about how that there are the people who were like in charge back in Israel, the like kings and the people who had wealth and power. And there are those folks who experienced this huge like change when they became enslaved by Babylon, right? So they went from being the most high, the most powerful, and then now they're enslaved people, right? So there's a huge change for them. But the other group of people that experienced this were the people that didn't have a lot of power back in the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. But they were the people who were just like everyday folks who maybe didn't have a lot of power, didn't have a lot of resources. And so Brueggemann talks about how these two groups of people were kind of experiencing different things. The people who had like riches and power before are like, the world has turned upside down for them, and like everything has changed and it's awful, and they're experiencing defeat in a way they never have. But for the everyday folks were already super oppressed in the community of Israel. So Ezekiel and especially Ezra, no, not Ezra. Who am I thinking? Who was the shepherd, the goat herd? I'm trying to remember which prophet it was. Somebody's going to have to remind me in the chat. Who was the one who has the passage about how the rich are going to be taken away from Israel on hooks, which is like the creepiest image to me?
Wow.
Somebody remind me of which prophet this is. But basically, like the poor and the oppressed were already oppressed in their original place, and then they get taken away and enslaved, and they're like, well, this is just more bad stuff, and everything is bad forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so Brueggemann talks about how like this task of the prophet is to kind of do two things in terms of talking to these two groups of people. So Brueggemann says, the second function of prophecy is this: the royal consciousness, so like the people in power who have like they create the way people think in that time, the royal consciousness leads people to despair about the power to move toward new life. Once you're oppressed, always oppressed. That's sort of the idea. Mm-hmm. It's the task of the prophetic imagination and ministry to bring people to engage the promise of newness that is at work in our history with God. Numb people do not fear or discern death. Conversely, despairing people do not anticipate or receive newness.
Wow.
So if you're already numb, if you already are despairing and hopeless, the prophet is supposed to speak to you to tell you there is a new way of going forward. And a lot of times the people in power don't want there to be a different way forward. So the prophets have to speak against that too.
Wow.
I see Tom says, in terms of looking at some differences here, Tom says, I was struck by that my version, the Lexham Septuagint, says that Ezekiel is commanded to prophesy against the bones, especially when it sounds so uplifting to me, at least. Oh yeah, so do you prophesy against the bones or prophesy to the bones? That is an interesting difference. Yeah. And Caitlin reminds me that it's Amos. Thank you, Caitlin, for reminding me that it's Amos who says the creepy thing about the hooks.
Now
I can never remember which prophet.
Now I've got to revisit Amos next. That's quite the imagery.
It is. Amos talks about how Amos is like an animal herder who is called to prophesy, and then basically is told to go to the richest, most powerful people in Israel and tell them that they should stop sitting around drinking wine because the poor are suffering. And it's like he's intense.
Wow, that sounds like an example we should follow.
I know. I know. Ah, yes. Thank you, Caitlin, for that reference there. Amos 4:2. Ugh, not a great image. But Tom, I appreciate that difference there, prophesying against the bones versus prophesying to the bones. That's definitely an interesting. The only thing I'll say about this, from my knowledge, is this passage was written in Hebrew originally, and in Hebrew, my old Hebrew professor used to say that the most important thing in Hebrew are the prepositions, like of, with, at, for, to. Those are all examples of prepositions, right? And the problem is with Hebrew, one thing can mean multiple different prepositions. And so whether you're talking by someone or to someone or for someone or with someone, it can be based on grammatical cues to tell you which one of those it's supposed to be. And so because this is the Septuagint that you're reading, which is a Greek version or translated from a Greek version of a Hebrew version, it might have been just a difference in prepositions there, but it's an interesting translation decision. Well, let's see here. So we've got who these bones are. We've kind of talked about who they are. We've talked about what are prophets and why is Ezekiel doing this. I wonder what everybody's take is on Ezekiel's response to God. When God says, "Mortal, can these bones live?" I answered, "Oh Lord God, you know." I wonder what people's take on that response is. What does Ezekiel mean by that? How is Ezekiel saying it? What kind of tone of voice do you think Ezekiel is saying it in? So how about you, Peter? What do you think is going on with Ezekiel there?
I mean, to me, that sounds a little bit like he's rolling his eyes, like he's a little exasperated with God. like, oh, we're doing this again. You're going to put me in front of another confusing vision and then ask me this obscure question. Um, I don't know. I just get a little bit of that sense, the sort of reluctant prophet, kind of, Jonah vibes a little bit.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
and also just sort of maybe like frustration with um, knowing basically that God knows the answer to this question that God is asking, and yet they're still asking it. And
Mhm.
what is, like, why don't you just tell us the answer, God? Like, why do we have to continue to like go through this process of learning and understanding, like, why can't you just give us the answer?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, so maybe a little bit of eye rolling, a little bit of frustration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally see. Yeah, so Tom says, I never understood why God asked so many silly questions. Yeah, I think there's maybe a bit of like the what's that called? The Socratic method, the idea
Yeah, I
of
was
like
thinking
asking questions to like draw out somebody's
God's like
answers.
pedagogy or something.
Right, exactly. So, maybe that's part of it. But yeah, I can definitely see the eye rolling a little bit.
Mhm.
I and I recognize that this is me reading myself into Ezekiel
I
a
mean,
little
same.
bit, is yeah, the idea of like um maybe a sense of exhaustion, because if
Yeah,
Ezekiel has seen all of these terrible things happen to his people and is maybe just like, God, when do I finally get to give some good news?
yeah,
Like maybe some exhaustion around that. So a sort of almost a sort of a giving up, like a refusing to play the game, the like question game with God, because you're just like
yeah,
so tired.
yeah, yeah. I
I don't know.
definitely
I
hear
get a
that.
little bit of that.
Do you hear him saying you when he says do you think it is that of course they can't come back to life? These are dry bones. Do you think
Mm.
there's that sort of assumption on Ezekiel's part?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could also read it another way. You could read it as Ezekiel being incredibly like pious, to be like,
Mm,
of course, God, only you know, and you can make anything happen.
yeah,
And, through God, all things are possible. Like the very sort of, um, I'm just a mortal, what do I know? But like
yeah,
really meaning it.
yeah,
Um, so there's that possibility that it's that too.
yeah,
But I think it's very much up to interpretation because we don't have a lot to go on there except for what our imagination gives us, I think.
yeah.
Yeah, Tom says maybe Ezekiel's just waiting for the lecture that's coming.
Uh-huh. Yeah, there's a
Yeah,
here we go again kind of sense to this.
that is what it is. Yeah, here we go again. I
Yeah.
love that. Definitely. And I think, yeah, this idea of like maybe Ezekiel himself is feeling a bit of that hopelessness, that he's supposed to be like talking the people into a different version, but maybe Ezekiel's feeling a little bit of that hopelessness.
Yeah, his prophetic imagination is a little tapped out.
A little burnt out. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And Tom says this is the 37th chapter. I can imagine Ezekiel is done. Yeah, Ezekiel's a long book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I wonder what people think. So let us know what you think here. Why does God ask Ezekiel to prophesy to or against these bones rather than God just doing it and having Ezekiel watch? Um, because God could have, and if we wanted to read Ezekiel's answer as very pious and very like, God, you can make anything happen. It seems like maybe Ezekiel was just standing there waiting for God to do it, and just to
Hmm.
be there to sort of witness it and tell people about it. But instead, God actively involves Ezekiel in the moment by saying, prophesy to these things, right? First is prophesy to the bones, and then it's prophesy to the breath and all these things. So why do people think God involved Ezekiel in that way? Why do you think that happened? And you mentioned the idea of co-creation earlier, Peter. So I think you probably have an idea about that.
Yeah, that was sort of my I don't know. I think it's interesting what you say about, his pious response. And I almost feel like it could be a kind of like rote piety too, where it's
Mm.
just like, this is what I'm supposed to say. This is, I'm just giving it over to God. There can be this sort of it can almost mask itself in piety, but really it's sort of a desire to not have to take action or not have to acknowledge our own uh, ability to make change in our own lives or in the world, you know. So it seems like kind of a correction, like that God is giving to Ezekiel of like, no, I want you to be part of this work with me, you know.
Yeah.
I expect that from you.
Yeah, I love that. It's sort of sorry, I got distracted by Brian's comment here. Brian says, I think it was more God having him play a part in their work. We are co-creators. Yes, absolutely, Brian. Yeah, I like the way you frame that, Peter, as almost the example of when people are just sort of like thoughts and prayers that this will get better, but they don't actually do anything about it. And maybe that's sort of the same thing where if maybe, and like, you know, there could be, in the same way we talked about how there could be like a seed of something very real and true and human about our nostalgia for something, even if it's misplaced. There could be an exhaustion from Ezekiel, a God, can you just do this and stop playing games with me, that can also be very real.
For sure.
But maybe God's pushing back on that idea of like, you can't just sit back and like you can rely on God, but you can't just assume that you play no part in it, maybe.
Right. That we are part of the way God works.
Right. Yeah. I see Tom says, co-creation, God obviously doesn't need Ezekiel, but I think it makes God happy when we work together, like when little kids try to help. I love that. Yeah. I remember I was introduced to the idea of co-creation both from Terence Fretheim, who was a professor of mine at Luther, and then also by Justin Sabiatanis, who wrote one of the foundational books on trans theology, both of whom talk about this idea of like, if humans are made in the image of God in Genesis 1, and God's first words to humans are about their relationship to the earth, like, and their relationship to the rest of creation. And all we know about God in Genesis chapter 1 is that God creates stuff. Like humans are meant to create things, and we are meant to create things in relation to the rest of creation. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that in this story, the things that Ezekiel is interacting with, it's interesting that it's in a vision. It's not very physical things. Like it is physical things like bones, etc., but it's in a vision. Usually when humans are called to interact with things, it's real world things, and these are dream bones and dream breath, you know?
Yeah, and yet they're very I don't know, the imagery is so vivid that and so bodily, you know, so physical when it comes to like the description of the anatomy that we were talking about, you know, like every part of the body being rebuilt. It doesn't feel abstract at all. You know, it doesn't feel removed in a vision. It feels very physical.
That's true. Yeah. Amory says, Ezekiel speaks the word on God's behalf, and the spirit, wind, ruach, which is the Hebrew word, moves from the four corners, just like the original act of creation in Genesis. So yeah, speaking of Genesis, there's definitely some of the same imagery here, right? Like in Genesis 1, or actually Genesis 2, God creates the earth creature out of the earth, out of the dust, out of the soil, and then God breathes breath into that earth creature, right? And in this case, you've got the bones and the sinews and the skin and everything, and then the breath comes into the creature. So that's very similar imagery to Genesis 2.
So it's really one of the most like one-for-one examples in scripture of co-creation, really, because it's a human being participating kind of step by step in the same creative process. That, you know, that God used at the beginning.
Yeah. And I suspect that's what Ezekiel is like. That's why God is doing this with Ezekiel, or why God is giving this particular vision to Ezekiel, is because they need a new creation. Like the people need a whole starting over. And so if this is a second Genesis, it points to that idea of like, we're starting over. God is going to recreate something different. but still out of the bones that existed before. So I wonder, I'm trying to remember what you said about earlier about this idea of like taking little pieces or taking the bones that came before, but still needing to do something new, right?
Yep. Yep.
And I was thinking about the image of or about the question about suddenly it just sort of occurred to me, like, I wonder if Ezekiel knew any of these people. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
what if you actually had relationships with, like, if this is Ezekiel's community and Ezekiel is able to see them come back to life, like the structure of the story is very much like the people are all together. It's like the people are moving as one body, even as their individual bodies. But I kind of wonder if Ezekiel could like recognize people, you know? I don't know.
And how much they look the same and how much they are maybe very different than how he remembers them.
Yes, absolutely.
In their new creation.
Exactly. And I think, like, as trans and gender expansive folks, we often get into conversations about like what we will look like in heaven or what we will look like in you know, like when we are, if you're from a tradition that believes in like the resurrection of the body and like how that, like how we will look. And I wonder, I don't know, this sort of reminds me of that, this sense of like Ezekiel may have seen things in a different way, even though the ingredients are the same. Like, it reminds me, this is a kind of a goofy analogy, but it reminds me how you can take the same ingredients and you can either make like a cake or you can make bread or you can make, you know, like you basically the same few ingredients and you can make a bunch of different things. And I wonder if something similar is going on here where it's like, okay, well, we have some of the same ingredients of people in our community, but we need to create something that looks different.
Yeah.
All right. So this idea here, I'm looking at our notes here. We talked about the breath. We talked about it kind of coming from the four winds. Why, I wonder, folks in the chat here, why do you think these actions are done sort of in these stages? And maybe we touched on that a little bit in terms of like connecting it to Genesis, right? But why do we have like a chunk that's like the bodies are coming together with all the bones and then the breath is coming? Like, is it just an allusion to Genesis? Are we saying something about bodies and spirits and souls? Like, what's happening here with the multiple pieces of this remembering? What do folks think about that? I'm just noticing Tom's comment here. I hope not. I assume in connection to the question about if Ezekiel recognized anyone, not because he wouldn't miss them, but just because I don't think I'd want to watch my mother becoming enfleshed. Yeah, that's a very good point, Tom. I think there is something very visceral, right? Like I think the word visceral comes from something about viscera and bodies. So I think that's a good linguistic connection. But like
inner organs.
Right. Yeah. There's something very visceral about this image of bodies coming together and then sort of being breathed into it. And it reminds me of, like, I think when we imagine, or at least when I imagine this visual, I imagine it in a very sterilized way. But like this was probably really messy. And like not in a like gross you out kind of way, but in a real way, in the fact that our bodies are messy, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe you wouldn't want to see this come together, or you would have an experience of like, I don't know, it just wouldn't be as clean as you maybe would want it to be. Although it is a vision, so you never know.
What was the experience like if we're imagining it from the perspective of the people being put back together again?
Yeah. Okay, hold on to that thought, but I want to look at what Brian says. Brian says, I think it's the fact that we all go through seasons of changes with God. I love that, Brian. That idea of like you have a season of bones coming back together and a season of like things coming back onto your bones and a season of being breathed into, right? I love that.
That's that definitely strikes a chord for me. I can just and talking once again about the resonance of this story for trans and gender expansive folks, like just the ways in which we are the ways we choose to transition with our bodies, like the way that those steps can be uncomfortable sometimes, or we have to like encounter our bodies in new ways or integrate into our bodies in new ways. It's not always like, of course, there's lots of joy in that process too, but it can also be really difficult and uncomfortable and messy and complicated. And there's very much a sort of sense of rebuilding ourselves in the that this image seems kind of applicable to that.
Definitely. Yeah. I think there are things about, like, for me, the experience of being on hormone therapy and then getting top surgery was like my center of gravity changed. Like I had to learn how to move differently in the world. And like those seasons of getting used to something doesn't all happen at once.
Yeah.
So maybe this sort of idea of stages. And so that's very physical, but I think it can speak, like Brian said, to our relationship with God too, that like a lot of us have had seasons of maybe being, what's the nice way to put it? Zealots in a way about our faith. I think maybe many of us have had those seasons. Many of us have had seasons of kind of maybe wanting to burn the whole thing down. Many of us have maybe had seasons of reconnecting with God and going, wow, I just don't know anything anymore. So seasons of that relationship too makes sense.
Right.
And not to downplay any of those as being like less important because they're seasons. Like they're all very important and real. Let's see. Brian says, I feel like all our bodies coming together is how God works all things out for our good. I'm going through that right now as I prepare for shop surgery. Oh, Brian, congrats.
Oh, awesome, Brian.
Yeah. Yeah, and Tom says, people looking at us from the outside might not understand. That's very true. I think, yeah, so speaking to that sense of like, what were these bodies that were coming back together? How were they feeling? Like maybe, like, what if Ezekiel was a little bit off-put and grossed out? That doesn't make the remembering of those bodies any less beautiful to the people experiencing it,
Yeah.
Or
any less like God working in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like you had something, Peter, earlier about the feeling of being put back together, and then I asked you to hold the thought, and now I forget where it went.
Feeling of being put back together. Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about it, just how it can both be uncomfortable and be integrating and beautiful and joy filled kind of at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, good. There's just congratulations from Tom to Brian there. Yeah, I think the last kind of question about this text I want to talk about, and then we can talk about some more about how this relates to our lives, to all of our lives. I think one of the interesting things about this vision is that we cut away at the end of it, and then it's just not referenced again. That like Ezekiel has this thing, and then the next thing that happens is like a whole different story after verse 14. And so we never get to find out like how did Ezekiel respond to what happened? Because the last thing we hear from Ezekiel is God says all this stuff, you will know that I am the Lord, etc. So after Ezekiel prophesies to the breath, Ezekiel is just there and we don't get Ezekiel's reaction to what happens, and we also don't get the people's reaction really to this idea. And so I wonder what folks in the chat think about how this vision might have changed Ezekiel, and how, like, what do you think, if you were in Ezekiel's shoes, how would this have changed you going out? Would you feel differently? Would you feel a sense of hope? What would you tell other people about it? How would you kind of like become a prophet or be a prophet when you've just had this vision? I think for me, I would be like, obviously a mix of emotions from just having something like this happen. But I think I would be invigorated. Like I think I would be excited about it, but I wouldn't really know how to talk about it with other people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like this sense of like, I've just seen something amazing. I've been part of the act of something amazing. I don't know how I would explain that to other people. Yeah. Brian says, sometimes there is no closure on this side of the veil. That is true enough, Brian. Sometimes you just don't get closure.
Yep.
What do you think, Peter?
Well, I mean,
do in Ezekiel's
he's
shoes?
immediately called into like this last part of the passage is basically God saying, "Go prophesy now about this." So he doesn't even get a chance to like um, sit with this and process it, and like he's immediately challenged to go out and act in response to this vision. That sounds difficult to me. I'm someone that needs time to kind of process, and sometimes we just don't get it. Sometimes we have to take the next step even if we don't feel ready for it, when it comes to sort of how God is moving in our lives and the ways in which God is challenging us to move with them. So that reminds me very much of like those times in my life that I've experienced where it's been like, nope, you can't wait any longer. You can't take any more time to think about this. It's time to prophesy. It's time to act. It's time to, allow God to work in you through you.
Definitely. And there's that sense of, I was just reading this passage the other day. I think it's in Matthew, but where Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he talks about how, like, he essentially says, like, a lot of bad stuff is going to happen to you because you followed me. And it's kind of a depressing moment. But at one point he says, like, when they bring you before judges and things, don't prepare your defense ahead of time because I'll give you what to say when you get there.
Yikes.
And that to me, like, it's terrifying, right?
Yeah.
But that's, I think, kind of what's going on. This sense of like, Ezekiel probably didn't know how to explain this to somebody else. And in fact, perhaps Ezekiel doesn't explain it to anyone else. Perhaps he literally just tells him this story because this is Ezekiel's writing after all, right? Maybe Ezekiel just writes down exactly what happened and then lets people take from that what they will without interpreting it for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. It's wild. Yep. Left with some unanswered questions there. Well, let's come back to this idea of like, of some of the things that this might bring up for us. I think a lot of us have had times when we feel like we just want God to take care of something and stop asking us trick questions. And we've probably all had times in our life where we have felt sort of like hopeless and unsure of the future and not sure if a new thing could happen. And I think this story can be an encouragement in that moment to see God bringing life out of death. I think that's, I mean, at the end of the day, I think that's probably what people took out of this story, was the idea of like, we are so afraid of death because death is the end, but the story tells us that death isn't actually the end. There can be something beyond that. And I know for me, like, transition definitely felt like that. Like you've kind of mentioned, Peter, that it was like, I felt like I was looking at my life, like my life was ready, like I was going to explode if I did this, right? And like everything would go away and everything would die. And it was like, but that was the only way through it, was to go through that and realize that there was something else on the other side. So I think a lot of folks have had experiences like that. I think about, even as Brian is talking about getting top surgery, there's a bit of a metaphor there with like, when you get top surgery, they put you under anesthesia, you go to sleep, and then you wake up again. And it is almost like waking up for the first time, I think, for a lot of people to have any kind of affirming surgery like that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I remember that moment, waking up from that surgery. I was just barely, I was still kind of coming out of the anesthesia, and I hardly even remember doing this, but I texted like all of my close friends individually. Like my best friend was sitting there with me, but I texted all of them, and I did, like, my text just said, "I'm so happy." And I don't remember sending them, but like all of my like closest friends got this text from me, like in the midst of me waking up from anesthesia. And that's kind of like a precious thing to remember, is that
beautiful,
kind of really resurrection moment, but also, like we've been talking about in this story, like this moment of resurrection is not like an instantaneous thing, and it's not a super sanitized, only spiritual thing either. It's this gradual process. It is uncomfortable, it's messy, it's not it doesn't just happen instantaneously. God just doesn't, kind of like wave the wand. It's a process that is communal. It's a process that is physical, it's all of those things. It's not neat and tidy.
Yeah, it's true. And I think there's, we don't have a ton of time to get super into it, but there's a lot we can say about the communal aspect of this. That it's like I said earlier, like the people of Israel are treated in this story as very much like a unit. And even the language around it, like the Hebrew around it, I think there's which line is it that it's the whole host of Israel, and then there's a verse about breathe upon these slain that they may live. This sort of idea of like a phalanx or like a group that moves together is kind of what's being hinted at with the language that's used.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to think about that each person is individually being remembered and put back together, but then communally they are also being remembered and put back together. So both kinds of bodies are happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder, I don't know, this is just a random thought to fly off into the universe, but I wonder what it would look like to think about, like we often talk about trans communities, plural, because we're so different and we live in different places and have very different experiences around gender. I wonder what a body of trans community looks like, because we are so different. Like, is it even possible to be one body? Is that something we should even want as a community? We talk often about being one body as Christians, right?
Yeah.
And we're like
Yeah,
held in one body as the church. But I kind of wonder what that community looks like for trans folks and gender expansive folks, because we are so different from each other in so many ways in how we understand ourselves and how we experience ourselves and others. I don't know, just a thought to throw out there. Ooh, and Brian says about the surgery. The surgery also takes away most of my cancer risk as well as affirming gender. So it's life-giving and life-saving. Aw, Brian. That's beautiful. So thinking about breath, thinking about this last thing that kind of is brought into these people, I think when I was first reading this passage, I started thinking a lot about Eric Garner, who is the man who was murdered by the police for selling cigarettes, essentially, and who was the one who said, "I can't breathe," which then became such a I was going to say image, but it's a phrase. It became such a encapsulation of what so many of our Black siblings were telling us about what it's like to live in this country.
Right.
And so the movement of breath in this passage reminded me of Eric Garner because of that. And it also reminded me, as I walk my dog around the neighborhood I live in, there's a sign that I walk by in one of the yards that says, "What will you do with what will you do with your breath?" And it's such a powerful sign every time I walk by it. I think about that. And so this use of breath and spirit and being given this breath and what will you do with your breath to make sure that other people can breathe has been something that I keep thinking about through this whole passage. So I wonder what folks in the chat think about like what we are meant to do with our breath. What are we called to do as people who have sort of been breathed into? What does that look like to you? And it can look like a lot of different things. I think for many of us, it can be a sense of honoring that breath that has been breathed into us by living as God made us to be. And that might not be, exactly how with the bodies exactly like we were when we were born, because we were babies then. But like honoring that in breathing through things in our life and through how we interact with others seems to be a real big part of this passage. I don't know. You have any thoughts on that, Peter?
I do really like these sort of parallel meanings of breath, how it's both, kind of means the spirit, God's spirit breathed into us, our souls, like all of, breath is kind of used in that way, but it's also just this very physical, like the sort of, one of the main things that our physical bodies do that, shows life, that keeps us alive, that it can be both.
And that we don't even realize we're doing it. Like that's one of the weirdest things is like, obviously we can pay a lot of attention to it, but if we don't think about it, we just do it automatically,
Mhm.
which is, I hope, the way it's supposed to be in terms of how we honor that breath that we've been given. Is theoretically, we should be able to just not even realize that we're doing it half the time. We're
Right.
just living it.
Yeah, it's just part of who we are.
Yeah. So I think the last thing here is we've got this question. When you look around and you see death and hopelessness, can you imagine what it would look like if the spirit returned to those places? The first step toward a different future is being able to imagine it. And that seems to be what the prophets are trying to do here. What Ezekiel's trying to do is to imagine a different kind of future. So can you imagine what it would look like if the spirit returned to places that feel dead right now? I see Brian says, honoring the spirit and honoring the breath is living openly as a trans non-binary person who's also in recovery to show folks happiness and joy is possible even during the storms of life. I love that, Brian.
Love that.
And Amory says, breath is life. For Christians, Jesus breathed his breath upon his disciples. Yes, another good breath image there. Yeah. I think when I think about what it would look like for the spirit or the breath to return to things that feel dead, for me right now, would be breath in sort of openness, like having a chance to breathe in, being able to really be like, okay,
Yeah.
a deep breath, a moment to pause, and having, I think so much of what feels dead around me right now is people just feeling exhausted by life. And so having the breath and the moment to just pause and rest feels like what the spirit would look like returning to those spaces, I think. How about for you, Peter?
Yeah, I think that seems right. But I still do like this idea that we kind of talked about at the beginning of God making something new in addition to bringing life back into what has died, like also like creating something new, like building something new on these bones. So I keep coming back to that idea too of like, and the prophetic imagination we were talking about with Brueggemann too. Like, what can we imagine that's what seems impossible, and can we imagine that thing? Because maybe that's how God is leading us.
Right. Yeah. And the idea of the breath coming to not just revive exactly what was before, but to come to invigorate something that uses the bones of what was before, but that hasn't even been birthed yet.
Right. Exactly.
Good stuff. Well, I think unless anybody has any final thoughts in chat here, we will close things up for tonight. We didn't even get to our dance translation of this passage, which we were going to talk about, and we didn't even get to it. So what I'm going to do is Peter found this great video, and so I'm going to put it in the description of this video as soon as we're done here going live. We'll fix the description and we'll put this link in it as well so you can see it. But Peter, what do you want to say about this video and why you thought it was interesting?
Yeah, I found this this video by a scholar and performing artist, Christopher Rasheem McMillan. He is a professor at the University of Iowa. And he did a dance piece that he described as a translation of this passage. And it was actually published in a journal called Ancient Exchanges, which describes itself as a journal devoted to literary translations of ancient texts, specifically in response to experiences of exclusion, limitation, and gatekeeping. So it's like giving people a voices a chance to speak to some of these texts that have been silenced, So I was really fascinated by it because it shows that there are other ways besides just intellectually to interpret scripture. Like we can use our bodies, we can use other parts of ourselves to respond to and interpret scripture. And that just seems like a really important exercise, especially in light of what this story is about.
Yeah,
you know?
especially for this story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll put the video in the description so you can see it. It's a really beautiful dance piece. It does include some nudity. So if that's something that you're sensitive to, be aware of that. But it's in sort of silhouette. So it's not like just a nude person. But it's beautiful. And I think celebration of bodies, especially in this passage, is really important. So I think that was a really interesting and beautiful artistic choice that the creator made. So having said that, I think we'll close it out for tonight. Let's see, any last things to note? First of all, noting that we have we have a new website up at transmissionministry.com. We just redid our website thanks to Micah Melody, who is again on a well-deserved vacation. So go check out the new website because it looks beautiful. It's amazing. The calendar actually works. You can see when all of our events are. So go to transmissionministry.com to check out the new website. And then I'm putting a link here in the chat to our workshop coming up next week. It is almost a week from today. And it is specifically on mutual aid and community care. And it's going to be amazing. I think a lot of us have heard a lot about community care and mutual aid, and you might be like, well, what is it? How do we do it? How do we do it for each other? And we're going to find that out from somebody who is especially skilled in it, from Kenya Cummings, who is a person doing this on the ground right now. So make sure to come to that. And then our next Bible study live will be, I wrote down the date here, next Bible study live will be on September 21st. So we're doing the third Wednesday of the month. So I think those are all the announcements. So thank you all for being with us tonight. And thank you, Peter, for bringing your insights. And we will see everybody again soon. Bye, everyone.